The morning Mae Dawson led her last good horse to Callum Briggs's trading post was the morning she decided she was done being proud. Pride didn't fill a child's belly. Pride didn't put seed in the ground. And pride certainly didn't keep the wolves, the four-legged kind and the two-legged kind both, from circling a widow woman's land when they smelled weakness hanging off her like wood smoke. Mae was 31 years old, with sun-dark skin and hands that had known more work than rest since her husband Thomas had died of fever the previous autumn, leaving her with 60 acres of dry Texas soil, a leaking roof, a 7-year-old boy named Caleb, and a debt at the feed store that made her stomach clench every time she thought about it. She had managed the winter by selling off the 2 older mares and slaughtering the pigs she had meant to breed in the spring. She had patched the roof herself with boards she pried from the old smokehouse that had been rotting anyway. She had told Caleb stories by firelight, so he wouldn't notice that supper was smaller than it ought to be. But spring had come now, April of 1878, and the ground was warming and she had no seed to put in it. Without a crop, there was no summer, no autumn harvest, no winter survival. The mathematics of it were simple and brutal, the way all real things in the Texas Hill Country were simple and brutal. Copper was her last horse. A copper-colored quarter-horse mare with a white blaze down her nose, 15 hands tall, and as fine an animal as Mae had ever known. Thomas had paid $40 for her 2 years before he died, which at the time had seemed an extravagance, so wild Mae had stood in the yard with her arms crossed and told him he'd lost his mind entirely. Thomas had just laughed, that big rolling laugh of his that she still heard sometimes in her sleep, and said a man who didn't believe in good horses was a man who didn't believe in tomorrow. Copper was worth $45 at market, maybe more if the buyer had any sense. A full season of seed-grain corn, squash, and some winter wheat would cost her $14 at Briggs's post, which was the only trading operation within a day's ride. The numbers made sense. The decision made sense. But Mae's chest ached with a hollow, bruised feeling all the same as she walked the mare down the dusty main road into the town of Harlow, Caleb trotting along beside her with his hat pulled low and his jaw set in a way that reminded her painfully of his father. "You don't have to come," Mae said. "I want to come," Caleb said. He reached up and took Copper's lead rope from her hand without being asked, walking with the kind of quiet dignity that 7-year-old boys sometimes found when they sensed the adults around them needed steadying. Mae let him hold it. She put her hand on his thin shoulder for a moment, then let that go too. Harlow wasn't much of a town. There was Briggs's trading post and general store, a blacksmith, a saloon called the Dusty Rail that served mediocre whiskey and occasional violence, a small white church that the Reverend Aldous kept spotlessly maintained, and a scattering of homes along the 2 main streets. On Saturday mornings, the town swelled with ranchers and farmers coming in from the surrounding land, trading news and goods and gossip with the particular intensity of people who spent most of their days in profound isolation. This was a Wednesday, which meant the streets were quiet and the business at Briggs's was mostly locals. Mae tied Copper to the post outside and told Caleb to stay with the horse. He looked like he wanted to argue, but she gave him the look that had ended arguments before they started since he was old enough to understand it, and he turned back to the horse without a word. Callum Briggs was behind his counter when Mae pushed through the door, which jangled an iron bell above the frame. He was a thick, sandy-haired man of 50 or so, with small eyes that were clever in the way that prioritized profit over sentiment. He wasn't cruel exactly. He'd extended Mae credit over the winter in small amounts, and she was genuinely grateful for that, but he was the kind of man who always knew exactly what a thing was worth, and who was never confused about which side of a transaction he wanted to be on. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, pleasant enough. "What can I do for you this morning?" Mae laid her hands flat on the counter. She had rehearsed this, but rehearsing and doing turned out to be different animals. "I want to trade for seed grain," she said. "Corn, squash, and winter wheat, enough for 60 acres on the productive half of my land." Briggs tilted his head. That's going to run you toward $15. You got cash. I've got copper, Mee said. A silence stretched between them while Briggs looked at her with those small, assessing eyes. That copper mare of your husband's. She's mine now. He nodded slowly, already calculating. She's a fine animal. I could take her, sell her on for a good price when the drovers come through. He named a figure for the trade, $14 worth of seed against the horse's value, with him keeping the margin. And it wasn't fair, but it was functional. And Mee recognized that in her position she didn't have a great deal of room to argue about fair. She was about to accept when the door behind her opened and the bell jangled again. She didn't turn around immediately. She was focused on Briggs, on keeping her expression steady, on not showing the grief she felt at losing Thomas's horse, at losing the last real thing of value she owned in the world. "Give me a moment," Briggs said, looking past her at whoever had come in. "Take your time," said a man's voice low, even with a slight roughness to it, the kind of voice that didn't push itself into a room but filled it anyway. Mee turned then, because the voice was somehow familiar and somehow not, the way a melody is familiar before you remember the words. The man standing inside the door was somewhere around 34 or 35, she guessed, with the lean, weathered build of someone who had spent a long stretch of years outdoors. He wore a plain canvas duster coat, trail dusty, and a dark hat with a straight brim. He had dark brown hair showing at the edges of the hat, and a jaw that hadn't met a razor in several days, and eyes the color of creek water in deep summer, more gray than blue, shifting with the light. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, attentive and careful, like a man who paid close attention to things and kept most of his conclusions to himself. He was a stranger. She was certain she'd never seen him in Harlow before, and Harlow was small enough that she knew most faces even if she didn't know names. "Pardon me," he said, with a small, brief nod that acknowledged her without presuming anything. Mee turned back to Briggs. "We have a deal," she said, before she could think about it longer and lose her nerve. $14 of seed grain for the horse. Briggs wrote it up. Mee signed the paper. The whole transaction took less than 10 minutes, and at the end of it she had bags of seed arranged on the counter for loading, and no horse. She was proud of herself, in the dry, hollow way that competence without joy often felt. She had done the necessary thing. She would do the next necessary thing and the next, until she had gotten herself and Caleb through to the other side of this. She went outside to tell Caleb. He listened to her explain it, that copper would be going with Mr. Briggs, that the horse would be fine, that the seed was more important right now, and he didn't cry, which was somehow worse than if he had. He just nodded with that small, serious face and reached up one more time to press his forehead against Copper's neck, and then stepped back and let the mare go. Mee's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. She began loading the seed bags onto the small flatbed cart she'd brought, pulled by the old mule Absalom, who was slow but faithful. The bags were heavier than she remembered things being, or maybe she was just tireder than usual. She heaved the first one up and shoved it onto the cart boards, then reached for the second. "Allow me," said the man with the creekwater eyes. He was standing behind her, having come out of the trading post while she wasn't looking. He picked up the second bag with one hand and set it on the cart as though it weighed nothing, then reached for the third. "I didn't ask for help," Mee said, not unkindly but clearly. "No, ma'am, you didn't," he agreed, picking up the third bag. "But I've got 2 working arms and you're down 1 good horse, so it seems like a reasonable offer." She looked at him. He met her gaze with that same quiet attention, not aggressive, not pitying, just present. There was something in it that she couldn't immediately categorize, which was unusual. Mee was generally good at categorizing people quickly. It was a survival skill more than a social one. "Thank you," she said after a moment. They loaded the rest of the bags together. Caleb helped too, or tried to, dragging the smaller bags with his whole body weight thrown into it, and the stranger helped him without making a fuss about it or drawing attention to the assistance, just quietly positioned himself to make the task easier while letting the boy feel he'd done it himself. Mee noticed this. She wasn't the kind of woman who missed things. When they were done, she tied off the cart and turned to thank the stranger properly. But he was already heading back toward the trading post, his duster coat swinging easy around his legs, and didn't seem to be waiting for thanks. She climbed up onto the cart seat beside Caleb, clicked at Absalom, and headed back toward the farm, the bags of seed behind her representing everything she had left to work with. She told herself the ache in her chest about copper would pass in a day or two. She told herself the crop would come in and next winter would be different. She told herself a lot of things on that long, dusty ride home, and some of them she almost believed. His name was Wesley Rourke, and he had come to Harlow for reasons that were, at the moment he arrived, still somewhat unclear even to himself. He had spent the better part of 12 years drifting, which was a polite word for what it actually was, avoiding. He had grown up on a ranch in New Mexico territory, the second of 4 brothers, and had left at 19 when it became clear that the ranch was his older brother's world and his own needed to be discovered elsewhere. He had driven cattle up the Kisham Trail twice, had worked as a deputy in a small Kansas town for a year and a half, until the work started to feel like wearing someone else's coat, had done a stretch with a surveying crew mapping stretches of the Arizona territory, and had tried and given up on a small cattle operation of his own in the Texas Panhandle, when 2 consecutive droughts turned the grass to dust and the dream to arithmetic. He was, by most measures, a man who had not yet figured out what he was for. This bothered him considerably less than it probably should have, and considerably more than he let show. He had come to Harlow because a man he'd worked with on the surveying crew had mentioned it as a place where land could still be had at a reasonable price, and Wesley had spent the last of his wandering years accumulating enough money to consider settling in a way that actually meant something. He had saved carefully and lived cheaply, and he had somewhere around $600, a significant sum, in a locked box in his saddlebag. He had a good horse named Gable, a blue roan gelding with a sensible temperament and excellent feet. He had his tools, his rifle, his bedroll, and the vague but persistent sense that he was tired of moving and needed to find the place where he stopped. He had not expected the first thing he saw in Harlow to matter to him, but the woman at Briggs's counter had mattered to him in a way he felt before he understood it, the way weather changes before you see the clouds. She had stood there with her hands flat and her chin level and her eyes steady, making a transaction that was costing her something real, and she hadn't flinched or trembled or looked for sympathy. She had done the necessary thing with the kind of grace that comes not from ease but from practice at surviving difficulty, and Wesley, who recognized that quality because he had needed it himself, found he couldn't look away from her. Then she'd walked out, and he'd seen the boy press his face against the horse's neck, and something in his chest had shifted like stone, finding new ground. He finished his business with Briggs inquiring about land plots, getting some names and directions, and then he'd gone outside and helped with the bags because there was nothing else that made sense to do. He wasn't a man who performed kindness for an audience. He just did it because it was there to be done. He thought about her for the rest of that afternoon, which surprised him. He hadn't thought about a woman in a sustained way in years, not since a girl in Abilene who had married someone sensible and settled down before Wesley had figured out what he wanted to say to her. He set up a camp at the edge of town, fed and watered Gable, cooked himself a simple meal over a small fire, and thought about the widow woman with the flat hands and the steady chin and the boy who hadn't cried. The next morning he went back to see Briggs. He had spent the night making his decision with the same slow, methodical care he brought to everything. He had considered it from several angles, the way a man considers a piece of land before he puts money into it, looking at the shape of it, the drainage, the soil. And what he concluded was this: that a copper-colored horse was worth $45 at a fair price, and that a man who had $600 and a conscience couldn't watch a woman trade away her last good animal to survive and not do anything about it. He bought the horse back from Briggs for $40. Briggs tried for $45 and Wesley held firm because he had enough respect for himself not to get robbed out of sentiment, and then he went back to the trading post floor and looked at the transaction record Briggs had already written up. "The seed grain," Wesley said. "That goes with the horse." Briggs stared at him. "Beg pardon." "The seed she traded for. $14 of corn, squash, and winter wheat. She goes home with both." "Now see here," Briggs said, with the expression of a man trying to locate the catch. "That ain't how trading works. She traded the horse for the grain. You bought the horse. The grain stays sold." "Write up a new bill of sale," Wesley said. "The horse changes hands back to Mae Dawson. The grain she already paid for stays with her. I'm making up the difference." He set $45 on the counter, $40 for the horse's repurchase, and $5 to cover the grain cost he was effectively absorbing from Briggs's end of it, which was the fairest accounting he could construct of the situation. "That covers it." Briggs looked at the money for a long moment. He was a practical man, and $45 in his hand was $45 more than he'd had before Wesley walked in. He wrote the new bill of sale. Wesley took the signed paper, folded it twice, and put it in his breast pocket. He rode out to the Dawson farm that afternoon, leading Copper on a rope behind Gable. The farm was about 4 miles south of Harlow, down a track that was more suggestion than road, through cedar and scrub oak that opened eventually onto 60 acres of rocky Texas land with a creek running along the south edge. The farmhouse was small and in need of paint, but it was solid, and someone had recently replaced boards on the roof with wood that still showed its pale new color against the weathered gray. There was a vegetable garden staked out near the house, freshly turned earth still dark from watering. There were 2 wire fence lines that had been recently restrung. Mae Dawson had been working this land hard, and it showed. She was in the garden when he rode up, kneeling in the dirt with a trowel in her hand. The boy was sitting on the porch step with what looked like a schoolbook open across his knees, his face screwed up in concentration. A big brown dog of uncertain ancestry got up from the porch and barked twice, then apparently decided Wesley wasn't threatening enough to pursue further and lay back down. Caleb saw the horses first. He stood up off the porch step so fast the book tumbled into the dirt. "Mama," he said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be calm and failing beautifully. "Mama, look." Mae turned. She saw Copper first, that copper coat catching the afternoon sun the way it always did. And then she saw Wesley, and she got to her feet in a single motion with the trowel still in her hand, and her face went through several things very quickly that she then brought back under control. She walked to the fence line where he'd stopped the horses. Up close, in the full daylight, she was more striking than he'd registered in the dim trading post. Her hair was dark brown, coming loose from its braid in the way that working hair always did. Her eyes were dark and sharp and currently very complicated in their expression. "What are you doing?" she said. Her voice was steady but tight, the way a fiddle string is tight before it either makes music or breaks. Wesley swung down from Gable and held out the bill of sale. "Copper's yours," he said. Briggs signed the transfer back. Mae took the paper and read it. He watched her read it carefully all the way through, the way a person reads something they don't quite believe. Then she looked up at him. "You bought my horse back," she said. "Yes, ma'am. And the grain stays with you." The look she gave him then was not gratitude, exactly. It was something more complicated and more cautious. It was the look of a person who has learned through experience that gifts from strangers carry costs that show up later, usually at the worst possible time. "Why?" she said. He considered how to answer that because the true answer was complicated in ways he wasn't sure he could explain to himself, let alone to her. "Because it needed doing," he said, "and I had the means to do it." She stared at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was golden and the wind was moving through the cedar trees, and somewhere nearby a mockingbird was running through its entire repertoire, with the manic dedication that mockingbirds bring to every performance. "I don't take charity," Mae said. "I'm not offering it as charity," Wesley said. I'm offering it as one person doing a decent thing for another, which is different. He met her gaze directly. But I understand if that's not how it feels. And I'll go if you want me to. He meant it. He would have gotten back on Gable and ridden away and told himself he'd done the right thing regardless of whether she accepted it and tried to believe it. It would have been the truth, mostly. But Caleb had pushed through the fence gate and was standing next to Copper with both arms thrown around the mare's neck, his face buried in her mane, and Copper was dropping her great head and blowing softly into the boy's hair. And whatever Mae was going to say, she said something different instead. "I made coffee this morning," she said, after a pause long enough to contain an entire private negotiation. "There's some left, if you want a cup." It was, he understood, the most she was capable of offering right then, and it was real and it was enough. "Thank you," he said. He tied the horses at the fence rail and followed her toward the farmhouse, and Caleb came along too with Copper's lead rope still in his hand, talking to the horse in a steady, earnest murmur that made Wesley want to smile. The inside of the farmhouse was spare but clean, the way things are when a capable person doesn't have much to work with but takes care of what they have. The kitchen table had been scrubbed pale. The cast iron stove was clean. There was a shelf of books, more books than he'd have expected, and a child's drawing tacked to the wall that depicted what appeared to be either a horse or a large dog with a tail like a flag. A quilt on the back of a chair showed careful stitching in a pattern that must have taken a long winter to work. Mae poured 2 cups of coffee, black, strong, the way it was made in farmhouse kitchens everywhere, and set one in front of him and sat down across the table with her own. "You're new to Harlow," she said. It wasn't a question. "Arrived 2 days ago," he said. "Looking at land. Name's Wesley Rourke." "Mae Dawson." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "What kind of land are you looking for?" "Somewhere I can run a small herd. Start modest, build up." He turned his cup in a slow circle on the table. "I've spent enough years moving around. I want ground that's mine." Something in her face shifted, a recognition, maybe, or just an understanding of that particular kind of wanting. "This is good country," she said. "Hard but good. The creeks run year-round if you're near enough to them, and the grass comes back if you give it any kind of chance. That's what I've heard." They were quiet for a moment. Outside, Caleb's voice drifted in, still talking to the horse. The brown dog had apparently decided to join this conversation as well and was contributing commentary in the form of occasional short barks. "Your husband," Wesley said, and then stopped because he wasn't sure what he'd meant to ask. "Thomas," she said. "He died last September. Fever." She said it plainly, without looking away from her coffee cup, the way people state facts they have made their peace with even when they haven't entirely. "He was a good man and a good farmer. The land's better than it looks because of how he worked it." "I'm sorry," Wesley said. She looked up at him then. "Thank you," she said, and he heard the real thing in it, not the reflexive response, but actual acknowledgement. She seemed like a woman who could tell the difference between real and performed, and who appreciated the former. They talked for another hour. Wesley didn't plan to stay that long, and she didn't seem to expect it. But the conversation found its own rhythm and pace, moving through the practical, her plans for the crop, the sections of fence that needed work before she could use the south pasture again, the question of whether the creek had shifted enough in the last flood to threaten the lower field, and through other things that were less practical and more interesting. She had opinions about books, the ones on her shelf all read and reread. She had a dry, precise sense of humor that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. She asked him questions about the surveying work he'd done in Arizona and listened to the answers with genuine curiosity, which was rarer than he'd come to expect. When he finally stood to go, she walked him out to the horses. Caleb was sitting on the fence rail next to Copper, apparently having made the horse his audience for a story he was telling with considerable animation. "I'll be in Harlow for a while yet," Wesley said, settling his hat, "until I sort out the land situation. If there's anything on the property that needs another pair of hands." He stopped. He wasn't a man who liked to half-finish sentences, but he couldn't quite find the shape of what he was trying to say. Me's expression was thoughtful and guarded, and something else underneath both of those, something he couldn't name yet. "The south fence line needs restringing," she said. "I can't pay, but I can feed." "That's fair," he said. He rode back to Harlow in the long afternoon light with the feeling of a man who has found, possibly, the place where the moving stops. He came back on Thursday morning with pliers and wire, and the easy, no explanation manner of someone arriving to do a job rather than make an occasion of it. Mae was already at the fence when he got there, having started on the section she could manage with what tools she had. They worked through the morning mostly in the rhythm of work rather than conversation, the particular companionship of two people doing something physical together, which requires communication but not necessarily words. She was stronger than she looked, which was saying something because she didn't look fragile to begin with. She handled the wire with practiced efficiency, reading the tension of the line the way you read it when you've done it many times. She didn't ask for help at the moments when she didn't need it, and when she did need it she said so directly, without any of the performance that sometimes surrounded asking. Caleb brought them water in a tin pail around mid-morning, sloshing considerably and arriving slightly out of breath, and then planted himself on a nearby rock to watch with the focused attention of someone studying a skill he intended to acquire. "Can I try?" he asked when there was a pause. Wesley looked at Mae. She gave a small nod. Wesley handed the boy the pliers and spent 10 minutes showing him how to twist the wire splice, guiding his small hands through the motion. Caleb's face was carved with the concentration he brought to everything, and when he got a good splice that held tension, his expression broke open into uncomplicated pride that was hard to look at without smiling. "Good," Wesley said. "Remember how that felt." "I will," Caleb said, dead serious as though making a binding commitment. Mae was watching from a few feet away with an expression that Wesley caught only for a second before she turned back to the fence line, but it had been soft and private and not meant for him to see. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, salt pork and cornbread, and dried apple rings that Mae had put up herself the previous autumn, simple food made with care. Caleb ate with the singular focus of a growing boy, consuming an amount that seemed structurally impossible for his size. Mae refilled his plate without comment and ate her own portion with a quietness that Wesley had come to understand was not unfriendliness, but simply how she was a person who inhabited silence comfortably because she'd had to learn to. "You said you were looking at land," Mae said, when the meal was mostly done. "Anything specific come up?" "There's a section northeast of town," he said. "About 80 acres, former claim that was abandoned when the family moved west. Briggs has the title information. He drank his coffee. Good water access, some existing structure." Mae nodded slowly. "That be the old Harker place. The family left 3 years back. John Harker tried to farm it too dry. He wasn't bad at farming, he just didn't pick the ground well." She paused. "The structure's just a one-room cabin. It'll need work. I've built things before." She looked at him across the table. "I believe that," she said, with the slight precision of someone choosing their words intentionally. He wasn't sure what to do with that exactly, so he just finished his coffee and they went back out to the fence. The days that followed built themselves into something that surprised him. He had intended to come once, help with the fence, and call the obligation settled in his own mind. But the fence led to discovering that the gate hinges needed replacement, and the gate hinges led to noticing that the smokehouse had a section of wall that was pulling away from the foundation and would need bracing before it caused serious damage. And the smokehouse wall led to other things, the natural chain of a property that had been held together by one pair of hands and was grateful for the arrival of a second pair. He didn't push himself into her days. He came when there was work identified, did it, ate whatever she offered because refusing felt like making a greater fuss of the thing than it warranted, and went back to his camp in town. He was not a man who overstayed. He'd spent enough time in other people's spaces to understand how quickly presence became intrusion. but he found himself looking forward to the farm in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in a considerable stretch of time. The specific gravity of the place, the soft light through the cedar trees, the mockingbird's daily performance, Caleb's running commentary on the world as he experienced it, Copper grazing in the newly strung pasture, and me herself, always at the center of it, purposeful and real and quietly complicated. He was falling in love with her. He recognized this with the same methodical slowness with which he recognized most things, turning it over and looking at its shape from different angles before accepting what it was. He hadn't expected it, and he wasn't sure what to do with it, so for a while he simply let it be a fact he held privately and said nothing about. Me noticed things. This was simply true about her. She was observant in the way that people who have managed difficulty largely alone become observant, reading the texture of situations the way other people read words on a page. She noticed how Wesley never arrived without having thought through what was useful to bring. She noticed how he talked to Caleb, as a person with his own dignity rather than as a child to be managed. She noticed how he never once looked at her land with the appraising eyes of a man calculating its value to himself, only with the eyes of someone who appreciated what had been built here. She also noticed the way he sometimes went quiet when she was near, a particular quality of silence that was different from his ordinary thoughtful quiet, something more contained and deliberate, as if he were holding something back by an act of will. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she wasn't ready, which was true. She told herself that Thomas had only been gone 7 months, and that she was a practical woman with practical concerns, and that romantic entanglement was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. These were all true things, but she also found herself caring what Wesley thought when she said something. She found herself turning work in her hands differently when he was watching, not performing, exactly, just being more aware of how she moved through a task. She found herself asking him questions because his answers were interesting, not as a strategy for prolonging conversation, but because he was genuinely interesting, which was rarer than she had perhaps remembered. It was the 3rd week of April when things shifted. She had been having trouble with the back section of the lower field. The drainage wasn't right, and water was pooling in a way that would drown the seeds she needed to plant there. She had spent 2 days trying to work out how to fix it with the tools she had, and she was lying awake the 3rd night turning it over in her mind when she thought of something Wesley had mentioned, a water redirection technique he'd seen used in the Arizona territory, channeling runoff through a cut drain rather than letting it pool. She thought about it until dawn came pink through the window, then got up and started coffee. Wesley arrived mid-morning. She had the problem laid out in her mind cleanly, and she explained it to him at the field edge, pointing to the pooling areas and the slope of the land, and where she thought a drainage cut might run. He walked the section with her, looking at the ground the way she'd learned to look at it, reading it, seeing where it wanted water to go rather than trying to force water to go against it. He asked 2 or 3 questions. Then he said, "You've got it mostly worked out already. You just take the cut about 4 feet further south to catch the second low spot." "I thought so," she said, "but I wanted a second pair of eyes." "Your read was right," he said, and he said it simply as a fact, which meant more than if he'd made a greater production of it. They worked the drainage cut together that afternoon, Caleb helping move the loose dirt with a small spade he'd claimed as his personal tool. The work was satisfying in the specific way that solving a problem always was: the moving of earth, the redirection of water, the land cooperating once you asked it correctly. As the light was going amber and the work was done, they stood at the field edge looking at the cut they'd made, the water already finding its new channel and flowing cleanly away from the field rather than pooling. "It'll take another day or 2 to drain fully," Mee said, "but then it's plantable." "Good," Wesley said. They stood there a moment longer than necessary, both of them watching the water move. The evening sounds were starting: crickets, a nighthawk somewhere overhead, the wind coming down through the cedar from the north with a breath of coolness in it that promised a fair night. "Wesley," Mae said, and then stopped, which was unusual for her. He turned to look at her. She was still watching the drainage cut, her hands in her apron pocket, and there was a kind of gathering in her face that he'd learned to read as meaning she was about to say something she'd been circling around for a while. "When Thomas died," she said, "I thought I was so sure that the main thing was to make certain Caleb didn't feel it as much as he could have. To keep things steady. To be steady." She paused. "I've been doing that. I'm good at steady." "You are," he said. But I think she turned to look at him then, direct and clear in the way she always was when she decided to be. "I think steady isn't the same as fine. I don't think I've been fine. I just told myself I was because fine was what was needed." He didn't say anything because nothing was required yet, and because rushing toward the end of what someone is saying before they've finished was a habit he'd broken years ago. "I think what you did," Mae said carefully, "with the horse and the grain, I think that was the first time in a long time that someone did something and I didn't have to account for what I owed because of it. I didn't know how much I needed that until it happened." The evening light was settling into the cedar trees, and the creek was making its soft, constant sound, and everything was very still around the edges of this moment. "I didn't do it to put you in debt," Wesley said. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." They looked at each other across the small remaining distance between where they stood. The gathered thing in his chest that he'd been holding carefully for weeks pressed against its own containment. "I like being here," he said, which was simpler than what he meant but was the truest available version of it. "I like this farm and that boy," and he stopped, then made himself continue. "And you? I like you, Mae." Her face went through something complex and quiet. She wasn't a woman who performed emotions, and so what showed on her face was real, the wariness still present, but the warmth too, equally real, moving through her expression like light through cloud. "I'm not," she shook her head slightly. "I'm not ready for everything that might mean," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for everything. I'm just—" He turned his hat in his hands, which was as close as he generally got to nervousness. "I wanted you to know where I stood, that's all." She nodded. Not a small polite nod, but something that went down into it. "I'm glad to know it," she said. They walked back to the farmhouse through the cedar-scented evening, not touching, not saying anything more. Caleb intercepting them at the door with a lengthy account of something the dog had done that afternoon that apparently involved 3 separate acts of miscalculation. And the moment folded itself away into the ordinary texture of the evening. But it had happened, and they both knew it had happened, and the knowing of it changed the air between them in a way that couldn't be changed back, which was, Wesley thought, exactly as it should be. He put his money down on the Harker place in early May. The purchase took a full day of paperwork with the county land office in the larger town of Red Fork, 15 miles east of Harlow. He rode out and back in a day and came home. He had started thinking of Harlow as home, somewhat to his own surprise, with the deed in his breast pocket, and a feeling he hadn't known in a long time, which was the feeling of having put his name on something that was going to stay. He told me about it the next morning. She was planting the corn in the lower field, the drainage cut having done its work and left the soil properly settled and dark. "You got the Harker place," she said, looking up from the seed row she was drawing with a stick. "That's good. It's solid ground if you work it right." "That's the plan," he said. "You'll need to dig the well out," she said. "The Harkers let it go too shallow before they left. It'll need to go down another 6 feet at least before it's reliable through August." He nodded, filing this away. "Anything else I should know?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him with that considering look she had. "The northeast corner goes to hardpan about 8 inches down. Don't try to plow it. Use it for grazing if you can fence it." "How do you know the Harker land this well?" "Thomas and John Harker were friends," she said. "We helped each other out in the early years. I walked that land more than a few times." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "I'll come look at it with you if you want, tell you what I remember." He was surprised she hadn't volunteered to come onto his land before, had kept a careful, invisible line around her own self and her own space. "I'd like that," he said. She brought Caleb, naturally, and they rode over on a Saturday morning, me on Copper, Caleb in front of her, Wesley on Gable, and spent 3 hours walking the property while me told him what she knew of it and where she'd seen the Harkers have trouble. The cabin was rough but structurally sound. The well was exactly as shallow as she'd said. The northeast corner was hardpan under thin grass, useless for plowing but decent for a small cattle run if fenced. Standing on the ridge of the north section with the hill country spreading out below them in the May morning light green from the recent rains, cedar and live oak and the silver ribbon of a creek in the distance, Wesley felt something in him that he had been looking for, without knowing quite what shape it would take, for a very long time. "It's good land," me said beside him. "It is," he said. Caleb, who had been investigating a large ant colony near a rock with the methodical dedication of a natural scientist, appeared at Wesley's elbow. "Are you going to live here?" he asked in his direct, cut-to-the-point manner. "I am," Wesley said. Caleb appeared to give this serious consideration. "Our farm is 4 miles that way," he said, pointing south with complete confidence in his sense of direction. "I know," Wesley said. "So you'd be a neighbor," Caleb said. "That's right." Another pause of consideration. "Mama says good neighbors matter more than most anything in this country." "She's right about that," Wesley said. Me, who was a few steps away and had heard all of this, was looking steadily out at the view with the expression of a woman who is carefully not reacting to something. Through May and into June, Wesley worked the Harker place, his place. He was still adjusting to that, into livable shape. The cabin needed a new door and new windows to replace the ones that had warped and cracked, and he built both, working with the quiet competence of a man who had put his hands to most kinds of construction at one point or another. He dug the well down properly, 6 feet further, hitting good water that ran cold and clear. He rebuilt the fence on the east side where the posts had rotted out. He also planted. He had gotten seed late in the season, a partial planting, corn and some squash, enough to see if the land would answer. He cleared and turned a section of the south field, which had better soil than anywhere else on the property, and put the seed in with the same care and attention he'd watched me put into everything she did. It was slow, solitary work, and he was accustomed to solitary work. But he found with some surprise that the solitude weighed on him more than it used to. He had grown used to the particular frequency of me's company, her dry observations, her competence, the way she thought through problems. And to Caleb, who had a way of making the world seem freshly interesting simply by paying close attention to all of it. He rode over to the Dawson farm on Sunday afternoons, which had become habit without either of them ever formally establishing it. He helped where help was useful, and otherwise simply shared the day porch sitting in the evening when the heat broke, coffee at the table, occasional meals that me cooked with a simplicity and skill that made everything taste better than its components suggested. They talked more now, and more freely. He told her about his years on the trail and in the survey teams, the dry comedy of men living in close quarters under difficult conditions, the country he'd seen that was beautiful in ways that were hard to describe to people who hadn't been there. She told him about growing up in Arkansas, a family of 7 children and not quite enough of anything, and how she'd met Thomas at a church social when she was 22 and married him 4 months later because she'd recognized immediately that he was the kind of man she could build something real with. "You weren't worried," Wesley said. "4 months is fast." "It's fast if you're choosing wrong," she said. "If you're choosing right, it's enough time." She turned her coffee cup. "I've always known my own mind pretty quickly. It's not a guarantee I've been wrong about smaller things, but when it's a person, I tend to know." He thought about that for a long time after he rode home that evening. It was a Thursday in late June when the snake problem happened, and it mattered more than it probably should have for reasons that had nothing to do with snakes. Caleb had been playing in the old root cellar at the back of the property exploring, which was one of his primary occupations, and had run back to the house shouting that there was a rattlesnake in there, a big one. Mae had gotten the hoe and gone down to deal with it, because rattlesnakes in the root cellar were a practical danger that needed addressing, and there wasn't anyone else to address it. Wesley arrived in the middle of this. He'd come by to return a hand saw she'd lent him, and found the cellar door open and me inside with the hoe and the snake coiled in the corner by the potato bin. The snake was indeed a big one, a western diamondback going on 4 feet. It was in the threat position, rattle going, and me was angling the hoe with the steady patience of a woman who had clearly dealt with snakes before and knew that patience and angle were everything. Wesley picked up a second tool from the lean-to, a long-handled garden fork, and went in with her. They worked it together without talking much, Wesley drawing the snake's attention while me brought the hoe down cleanly. It was over fast when it happened, efficient and unremarkable by this country's standards. But afterward, standing in the cellar entrance with the hoe across her hands and the evening light coming in over the cedar ridge, me looked at him and laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh without qualification or restraint, a real laugh, surprised out of her, at the sheer absurdity of the two of them standing in a root cellar having just killed a 4-foot rattlesnake on a Thursday evening in June. He laughed too, because it was genuinely funny, and because her laughter was the kind that caught at something in his chest and spread warmth through it. "Good teamwork," she said when she'd caught her breath. "Best I've had in a while," he said. Their eyes met for a moment. Then she looked away, but she was still smiling, and the smile stayed with her as she walked back to the house, and Wesley stood outside for a moment longer with the June evening spreading gold over the whole world and the feeling that everything, very quietly, was going exactly right. He asked her to take a Sunday ride with him in mid-July. He had thought carefully about how to ask. He wasn't a man who was awkward with words exactly, but he was deliberate, and this mattered enough to him that he wanted to get it right. He asked on a Tuesday when they were doing nothing of particular consequence, sitting on the porch after an early supper, Caleb inside at the table with his schoolwork, and he asked simply, without elaborate preface. "Would you ride out with me Sunday?" he said. "Just us." He considered. "We could bring Caleb if you'd rather." She was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of silence that meant she was considering something genuinely. "No," she said at last. "Just us is fine." Mrs. Aldous offered to watch Caleb on Sundays. She likes having company for him. He nodded, keeping his expression neutral, though something in him settled into its right place. They rode north on Sunday morning, up into the hill country where the land got rougher and more dramatic, and the views opened up over cedar-covered ridgelines that tumbled down to spring-fed valleys below. It was a day so beautiful it felt almost accusatory. The sky a deep summer blue, the air clear, and carrying the faint sweetness of cedar sap and wild herbs warmed by the sun, the whole landscape expansive and generous in a way that West Texas managed sometimes when it wasn't being difficult. They rode for 2 hours and talked easily, the way people talk when there is good country around them and no agenda to satisfy. They came to a spring that came out of the hillside into a clear pool shaded by cypress trees, and me said she'd known about this spring since Thomas had found it their first year in the hill country, and they watered the horses and sat on the flat rock at the pool's edge and let the morning spread around them. "Tell me something about yourself," me said, "that I wouldn't guess." He thought about it. "I read," he said, "more than you'd think from looking at me. I've carried a book in my saddlebag for the last 10 years. What kind? Everything. Whatever I could find or trade for, history, natural science, some novels." He turned a pebble in his fingers. "I read anything." She looked at him with a kind of pleased attention. Thomas thought reading was the most important thing a person could do. He taught himself from a Bible and then wouldn't stop. We had to carry those books when we moved here, which was not exactly practical given everything else we were hauling. She smiled at the memory, a different smile from her usual ones, warmer at the edges, turning inward toward something she loved. "What do you read in your saddlebag right now?" "A book about the geology of the Southwest Territories," he said. "It's technical but interesting if you like understanding why land looks the way it does." "I'd like to understand why my northeast section goes to hardpan the way it does," she said dryly. "I'll lend it to you," he said. She looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes. "I'd like that." The afternoon wound around them slowly and without any of the pressure that time usually carried. They talked and were quiet in turns, watching a red-tailed hawk work the thermals above the ridge, and it was the specific pleasure of being somewhere beautiful with someone whose company you valued without needing to perform anything for them. On the way back, as the light was going long and orange through the cedar, Mae spoke without preamble. "I've been thinking," she said, which was usually her introduction to something she'd been thinking about for longer than she was indicating. "About what?" he said. "About what I said at the field edge," she said. "In April, that I wasn't ready." He waited. "I'm still not," she paused, measuring her words. "I'm not certain about the future in the way I'd maybe like to be before I say things. But I think I've been using 'not ready' as a fence post when it should just be an honest thing to say about where I am." She glanced at him sideways. "I didn't want you to think I was keeping you at distance for a reason that doesn't exist." "What is the reason?" he said, carefully. "I care," she said simply. "That's all. I care what this is and I don't want to get it wrong." She looked at the road ahead, then back at him. "I haven't allowed myself to care about very many things this year. It's easier not to." She took a breath. "But I care about this. About whatever this is." He reined Gable in a little, bringing them to a natural slow. "Me," he said. She pulled Copper up too and turned to look at him. And in the late afternoon light she was so beautiful it was almost more than he knew what to do with, not in the way of performances or posed things, but in the way of a person who is entirely and completely themselves, nothing withheld. "This," he said, "is me being in love with you. I've been trying to figure out how to say it plainly, and that's the plainest version I have." Her breath caught slightly. He saw it. She looked at him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that was profound and real and not available to categorize from the outside. "I think," she said quietly, "that's what I'm getting toward too." He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a moment in the cedar-scented evening, two horses standing patient in the golden dust, the hill country spread around them in its indifferent and gorgeous generosity. Then she squeezed his hand and let go, and they rode the rest of the way home side by side, and the quality of the silence between them had changed entirely, had become something with space and warmth in it, something that felt like the beginning of a room being built. August came in hot and unforgiving, as August in the Texas hill country always did, and brought with it a problem that neither of them had anticipated. There was a man named Porter Hale who had a substantial cattle operation to the west of Harlow, 5,000 acres, several hundred head, a reputation for gradual, incremental expansion of his holdings that ran on the general principle that if a neighbor couldn't hold their ground, he'd eventually be in a position to absorb it. He had made an offer on the Dawson farm twice, while Thomas was alive, low, dismissive offers that Thomas had declined with polite firmness. After Thomas died, Hale had sent a representative in January with a third offer, somewhat higher but still below fair value, couched in language that implied Mae might be relieved to be done with the burden of managing the farm on her own. Mae had sent the representative back with a message that required no interpretation. In August, Hale himself came. He arrived on a Thursday morning on a good black horse with a second rider, his ranch hand, a big quiet man named Doan trailing behind. He was a man of 50-some years, prosperous-looking, with the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he decided he wanted. He was not overtly threatening. He was the kind of man who never needed to be overtly threatening because the size of his holdings did that work for him. Wesley was at the Dawson farm that morning, helping me repair the barn's south wall where the boards had been pushing out from the studs. He saw the riders come through the gate and stood up from his work, watching. Mee came out from the barn and wiped her hands on her apron and waited for the riders to reach her. The dog sat down next to her right knee with an expression of moderate suspicion. "Mrs. Dawson," Hale said, drawing up and not getting down, which was a choice that communicated something. "Heard you've been having a time of it. Thought I'd come out personally." "Mr. Hale," Mee said, with the tone of someone who has opened the door to a conversation they didn't invite. "I've brought a new offer," he said. "I think you'll find it generous. Your land plus the water rights I'm prepared to go to." He named a number that was more than the previous offers, but still, Wesley calculated rapidly, considerably below what the property with the creek access was actually worth. "Cash payment, quick close. You and your boy could be in town before autumn." "I see," Mee said. "It's hard country for a woman alone," Hale said, and managed to make this sound like concern rather than condescension, but only just. "I'm not managing it alone," Mee said. This was the moment Wesley chose to come out of the barn. Not aggressively, he didn't pick up anything or change his pace. He just stepped out into the sunlight and walked over to where Mee stood, and came to a stop next to her in a way that made the situation's geometry clear without a word being required about it. Hale looked at him with the assessing eyes of a man who has successfully acquired things for a long time. "And you are?" "Wesley Rourke," Wesley said. "I have the Harker place northeast of here." He kept his voice entirely conversational. "Me, Mrs. Dawson, and I are well acquainted." Hale absorbed this. Something shifted in his manner, not retreat exactly, but recalculation. "Well, the offer stands," he said to me. "You think on it." "I don't need to think on it," Mee said. "The answer is what it's been every time you've asked, Mr. Hale. This is my farm. It was my husband's farm. My son's going to grow up here. Thank you for the ride." Hale looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, then looked at Wesley once more, and then turned his horse and rode out with Doan behind him. Mee watched them go. She was absolutely still while they rode back down the track, and only when they'd passed through the gate and onto the road did she let out a long, slow breath and drop her shoulders. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "No," Wesley agreed. "Men like that don't. But there's a difference between a man who's used to easy acquirement and one who's going to do something genuinely crooked. What you've got to make clear is that you're not a soft target." She turned to look at him. "I just did, didn't I?" "You did," he said, "and so did having me standing there, which is just honest." He paused. "Next time you see him in town, be pleasant. Don't give him a grievance. Just be settled in your position." She nodded, turning this over. "You've dealt with this kind of man before." "Once or twice," he said, "in Kansas, the deputy work." They went back into the barn and resumed the wall repair, working for a while in the practical silence of work. Then Mee said, without looking up from the board she was holding in place, "Thank you." "For what specifically?" he said. "For walking out without making it bigger than it needed to be," she said. For not making it yours to solve." He looked at her. "It wasn't mine to solve," he said. "You had it." The expression that crossed her face at that was one of the most complete things he had ever seen from her. A kind of relief that was almost gratitude and almost grief. The expression of someone who had been doing everything alone for so long that being recognized for it landed differently than they expected. The fall came, and with it the harvest, and the harvest was good. Mee's crop came in better than she dared hope. Not a record yield, but solid and real. Enough to clear the remaining debt at Briggs's store, put food in the cellar for winter, and leave her with a small amount of cash reserve that felt like the first real margin she'd had since Thomas died. She picked the corn in 3 long days with Caleb helping, and Wesley coming over for 2 of those days to add his hands to the work. And then she stood at the edge of the cleared field on the 3rd evening with her hands on her hips, and her chest full of something that was as close to triumph as she'd allowed herself to feel in a long time. Caleb ran the length of the field with his arms out and his voice going up into the evening sky, celebrating in the inarticulate way of a child who understands what this means without being able to quite say it. The dog ran with him, equally inarticulate, and equally certain that something good had happened. Wesley's place yielded a modest corn harvest from the south section, modest but real, which was what a first season on new land typically gave you. He sold what he didn't need, kept what he did, and spent the autumn money on 2 young cattle, a small beginning, a handful of something that would build if he worked it right. They had fallen into, by September, a naturalness with each other that was beyond friendship and not yet fully named, though the naming was coming. They knew each other's working rhythms and silences, and particular varieties of humor. Wesley knew that Mae came back to hard things in conversation when she'd had time to think them through, often days later, and he learned to hold the thread until she picked it back up. Mae knew that Wesley expressed care in the physical language of attention and presence, and the doing of things rather than in declarations, and she had learned to hear what he meant rather than waiting for the precise words. He kissed her for the first time in late September. They had been sitting on the porch in the cooling evening after supper, Caleb inside and asleep, the dog on the step below, and the conversation had gone quiet in that easy way it sometimes did, the two of them just sitting with the night sounds around them. Mae had turned to say something. He never remembered afterward what it was, something ordinary, and they had found themselves looking at each other across very little space with the full weight of the months between them present in the air. He moved first. He set his coffee cup down and turned toward her, and he lifted his hand to her face, the question in it clear enough that she could have stopped it at any point, and she didn't stop it. She leaned into his hand and closed her eyes for just a moment, and then he kissed her gently, briefly, with all the care he had for things he valued. She kissed him back. It was quiet and slow and completely right, the way things are right when they have been arrived at honestly and without hurry. When they separated, she kept her eyes closed for another moment. He kept his hand at her face. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him, and the expression in them was everything, the grief still present as it always would be, but the living present too, equal and real, and the wanting of this. "All right," she said quietly, which was perhaps the most Mae Dawson thing she could have said in that moment, not a dramatic declaration but a simple, honest acknowledgement that something had been decided. "All right," he agreed. He proposed to her in October, over a kitchen table, in the most straightforward way he could manage. He had thought about elaborate settings, the spring in the hill country, the ridge view from his property, but then he decided that elaborate settings were for performing to an audience, and what he wanted was to say the real thing in a real place to the real woman without theater. So he came for Sunday coffee, and when Caleb had gone out to feed the chickens, he set down his cup and said, "I want to marry you, Mae, if you'll have me." She went very still. "I know it's been less than a year," he said. "I know that's fast by some measure, but I also know what I know, and I know you, and I know what I want." He met her eyes across the table. "I'm not asking you to forget Thomas or to hurry anything. I'm asking you to build something new with me if that's what you want too." Mae was quiet for a long time. He waited as he had learned to wait. "Yes," she said at last, not with the rising inflection of surprise or performance but low and certain, landing solidly like a stone finding still water. "Yes, Wesley, that's what I want." He came around the table and took her hands, and she stood and he held her, and she put her face against his chest, and for a while they stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the chickens making their commentary outside and everything still and present and entirely right. Caleb came back in and found them like that and looked at the situation with his characteristic assessment. "Are you hugging?" he said. Mae laughed and pulled back. "We are," she said. Caleb appeared to find this acceptable. In the thoughtful way he found most things acceptable when he'd had a moment to consider them. He put the chicken feed bucket down and said, "Are you going to stay?" He was looking at Wesley when he asked it. Wesley crouched down to eye level with the boy, which he always did when he wanted to talk to him seriously. "Your mama and I are going to get married," he said. "If that's all right with you." Caleb considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Would you live here?" he said. "Here or at my place," Wesley said. "We'd figure that out together, but yes, I'd be here." Another pause. Caleb's small face worked through whatever calculation it was working through. Then he said, "My papa died. the same way me stated facts she'd made her peace with plainly, as a truth that was part of the world now. "I know," Wesley said. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best," Caleb said simply. "Are you good?" Wesley looked at him. "I try to be," he said. "I can't promise I'll be the best, but I can promise I'll try hard every day." This seemed to satisfy something in the boy. He nodded once with his father's gravity and then went to the stove to see if there was any cornbread left over. They were married in November, at the White Church on Harlow's Main Street, the Reverend Aldous officiating in a ceremony that was small and real. Me wore a dress that wasn't new. She hadn't had the money for new and didn't have the vanity to need it, but that she'd pressed carefully and worn with a spray of late-season wildflowers that Caleb had picked and brought her that morning with uncharacteristic shyness, handing them over without meeting her eyes, and then retreating rapidly to the safety of standing by the door. She had not expected to cry. She wasn't a woman who cried easily or often, and she'd thought she'd made herself ready for this. But when Wesley took her hands at the altar and looked at her with those gray-blue eyes steady and warm and absolutely present, something in her chest simply opened, and the tears came quietly, without her permission. He caught one with his thumb without making anything of it. Just brushed it away, gently, the way you tend to something that matters. Briggs was there. He'd closed the trading post for an hour, which was practically unprecedented, and a handful of me's neighbors, and Mrs. Aldous, who had watched Caleb enough times over the summer to have strong maternal feelings about the whole family. The celebration afterward was coffee and cake in the churchyard, and Caleb ate 2 pieces and pronounced the frosting acceptable, which from him was high praise. They settled in the Dawson farmhouse, with the decision made that Wesley's land would run as the cattle operation while Me's continued as the crop farm, the 2 properties working in complement as they sat only 4 miles apart. The Harker cabin Wesley had fixed into good shape, and they went over regularly to tend the cattle in the south section. It was, in practical terms, a reasonable agricultural partnership as well as a marriage, which was in keeping with who they both were. The winter that followed was nothing like the previous one. The larder was full. The roof was solid. The wood was stacked deep under the lean-to. On the worst nights, when the north wind came down off the hill country and rattled the windows, they were inside together by the fire, and the warmth of it was not just the wood burning but the particular, earned warmth of 2 people who have built something real and know it. Caleb thrived. He had been resilient before, in the way children are when their people are consistent and present, but Wesley's presence had added something, a male steadiness, a different kind of attention, the patient passing along of practical knowledge that spoke in its own language of commitment. Wesley taught him to read the land the way he'd taught himself to read books, with attention and patience and genuine curiosity about what was being said. He taught him to splice wire, to read weather signs, to approach a nervous animal with slow confidence. He taught him to use a hammer without hitting his thumb, which Caleb had done twice with considerable drama before the lesson took. Me watched all of this with a fullness that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, and was grateful for every single day of it. In March of 1879, on a windy morning with the first real promise of spring in the air, Me told Wesley she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen again, because the kitchen was where they told each other real things. She set his coffee in front of him and sat down and looked at him directly and said, "We're going to have a baby." His face opened in the way that only completely genuine reactions do, the surprise, then the joy, moving through him in a visible wave that he didn't try to contain. He reached across the table and took her hand. "When?" He said, "September, I think," she said. "Maybe October." He was quiet for a moment, holding her hand, and his expression was everything she needed to see the full and complete happiness of a man for whom this was exactly what he wanted. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "Strong as a post, according to me." He laughed, and the laugh was warm and real, and it rolled through the kitchen the way warmth rolls from a good fire, filling the whole room. Caleb took the news with characteristic thoughtfulness. He spent the morning apparently processing it, and then at lunch announced that he had decided a brother would be better than a sister, because sisters required explanations he wasn't sure he was ready to give. Mae assured him she would keep his preference in mind, though the ultimate decision was somewhat outside her authority. The pregnancy went smoothly. Mae, who had made Caleb in a difficult year when Thomas was working 14-hour days, and she'd managed the house on raw determination, found this time easier in the specific way that having a partner made things easier, someone to split the work with, someone who noticed when she was tired before she admitted it herself, someone who came home at the end of the day and made the house feel like the right size. Summer came. Wesley's cattle herd grew by 4 calves, 3 of which survived their first weeks and went on to be healthy animals. Mae's crop was better than the previous year, which had been better than the year before, the land responding to consistent care in the gradual, faithful way land did when you worked with it rather than against it. Porter Hale came by one more time in June, with a last offer that was almost fair, a sign, Mae recognized, that he understood he'd lost this particular ground. She declined pleasantly, as Wesley had suggested, without animosity or triumph. Hale rode away and didn't come back, and the matter closed itself. The baby was born in late September, a boy, which Caleb received with the quiet satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. They named him James Thomas Rourke. Thomas for his grandfather, James because it was a name they'd both liked, and that sounded solid when you said it, the kind of name that could hold a life comfortably. He was red-faced and loud and had Mae's dark eyes, and what appeared to be his father's stubbornness, expressed in the form of opinions about feeding schedules that he communicated at considerable volume. Wesley held him the first night, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window while Mae slept the deep sleep of total exhaustion. He sat with this small, impossible person in his arms and the hill country dark and silent outside the window and felt the weight of it, the good weight, the kind that doesn't press you down but holds you in place, gives you gravity and root. Caleb appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, having apparently decided that sleep was less important than supervision of this development. "He's loud," Caleb said. "He is," Wesley agreed quietly. "He doesn't look like much yet," Caleb said, with the assessment of someone who has established expectations. "He'll grow into it," Wesley said. Caleb came and stood next to the chair and looked at his new brother with the intense, focused attention he brought to everything. The baby squinted back at him. "Hello," Caleb said to the baby. Matter of fact, an introduction. The baby blinked. "I'll teach you things," Caleb said. This seemed to be a decision he'd already made. "About the land and the animals and how to splice wire. Wesley taught me." Wesley looked at the boy beside him. 8 years old now, with his father's gravity and his mother's sharp eyes, standing straight in the night-cool air of the bedroom as though taking on a responsibility he was ready for. "That's good of you," Wesley said. Caleb looked at him sideways. "That's what you do," he said simply. "When you know something, you teach it." Wesley thought about this. "Yes," he said. "That's right." They were quiet then, the 3 of them, the man in the chair, the boy standing, the baby between them blinking at the dark window. Outside, a night hawk called from somewhere over the cedar ridge, and the creek made its constant sound, and the hill country settled into autumn around the farmhouse like a blanket settling. 2 years passed, and they were good years by any honest accounting. The farm grew. Wesley bought 2 more cattle in the spring of 1880. His herd was now 12 animals, small but well managed, and Mae added a second planted section to the south field. Having reclaimed ground that had previously gone to hardpan by a method she'd read about in an agricultural pamphlet that had arrived at the post office in Red Fork, and that she'd studied with the same attention she gave everything else she decided to learn. Caleb turned 10, and then 11, and grew along his father Thomas's general lines, tall and steady and deliberately thoughtful. He had begun helping with the cattle work on Wesley's land on weekends, learning what could be learned at that age about managing animals and ground. He had also turned out to have his mother's facility with books, reading everything that came into the house, and then asking questions about it that required actual thinking to answer. James Jamie, mostly, in the house was walking by 14 months and talking by 18, and had opinions about the world that he expressed with a directness that made his father laugh, and his mother recognize something she'd seen in herself. He followed Caleb everywhere with the devotion of a younger brother for an older one, and Caleb, true to his bedroom pronouncement, taught him everything he knew with the patient methodology of someone who took that job seriously. One evening in the autumn of 1880, me and Wesley sat on the porch after supper while the boys were inside. The evening was cool and clear, the first true autumn coolness after the long summer, and the stars were coming up one by one over the cedar ridge. Me was knitting. She taught herself in the second winter, having decided that wool things for the boys were more economical made than bought, and Wesley was reading the latest geological survey that had come through Harlow's small library exchange. The sounds from inside were Caleb reading aloud to Jamie, one of the adventure novels that had made it to Harlow by some route no one had quite tracked. "I've been thinking," Me said, which was her introduction to things she'd been thinking about for considerably longer than she was indicating. "About what?" Wesley said, turning a page. "About the property line to the east," she said. "The old Johnson Strip. 40 acres, creek access. The Johnsons moved west in August. Briggs says the title will be available." She knitted another row. "If we could take that section, we'd have enough water access to double the herd without worrying about summer running dry." Wesley set down his book and looked at her. She was looking at her knitting, but the particular angle of her head meant she was watching him peripherally. "We'd need to petition the county land office," he said. "Yes," she said. "I've written to them once already to ask about the process." She paused. "I hope that was all right." He looked at her with all the warmth that 2 years of this had built into the way he looked at her. "Me," he said, "you don't need to ask if it's all right to make the farm better. You never need to ask that." She smiled, still looking at her knitting. "Old habit," she said. "We can go to Red Fork together," he said. "File the petition." "Next week," she said. "Next week," he agreed. They got the Johnson Strip in December, added it to the combined property that they'd begun to think of simply as the Rourke place. Both sections, the farmhouse and the Harker land and now the Johnson Strip, all of it running together in their accounting and their conversation. 60 acres, then 80, now 140, with the creek running reliable through it and the soil showing, year by year, what it was capable of under consistent management. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was a good one. There was snow in December, which the hill country got occasionally, and which the boys treated as a personal gift from the universe. Caleb and Jamie spent 3 consecutive days building and destroying and rebuilding structures in the snow, with a creative determination that left the yard looking like a small, frozen city. Me made hot corn porridge in the morning and kept the stove going steady, and Wesley brought in extra firewood and mended the tack that had been accumulating repairs since October, and the farmhouse was warm and full and entirely the place it had always had the potential to be. Me found out she was expecting again in February. She told Wesley in the kitchen over coffee, as she always did. "October again," she said. "Give or take." He set down his cup and looked at her with that same open-faced joy she had loved the first time and loved now with the familiarity of knowing where to look for it. "Jamie's going to be outraged," he said. "He thinks he's the center of everything." "He is," she said. "He just won't be the only center." Wesley reached across the table and put his hand over hers. 2 years ago she had been a widow with an empty cellar and a horse she'd just traded away. And now she was sitting in her own kitchen with a warm house and a full larder and a man who looked at her across a table with eyes that said everything that was worth saying. She turned her hand over and held his, the way she'd done the first time at the fence line 4 years ago when everything had been new. "Are you happy?" he said. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Are you?" More than I knew how to be, he said before this. She squeezed his hand. Outside, the February hill country was pale and cold, the cedar trees silver-gray in the morning light, and Copper was in the pasture with her blanket on, and the smoke was going up straight from the chimney into a clear sky. And somewhere inside the house, Caleb and Jamie were making the particular variety of noise that meant they'd gotten into each other's territory and were negotiating terms. The baby was born in October. As predicted, a girl this time, dark-eyed and steady, who came into the world at first light with the efficiency of someone who had been ready for a while and saw no reason to delay. They named her Clara Jane, and she immediately established herself as someone with opinions she intended to share freely. Caleb received her with the solemn acceptance of someone who has had time to mentally expand his conception of acceptable outcomes. Jamie, at 2.5, was immediately and completely besotted, offering her his most prized possessions, a smooth rock, a length of copper wire that Wesley had given him, a cornhusk doll that Caleb had made him over the course of her first week. She accepted these tributes with equanimity. The farm went on. The years accumulated, and they were full years, years of work and harvest, and the particular satisfaction of ground that you have made something of over time. The cattle herd grew to 20, then 28, managed now with Caleb's active help in the ways that a 14-year-old who has been learning the land since 8 can meaningfully contribute. The crop section produced reliably, and me had the agricultural instinct for what the land wanted that came from years of learning to read it, and she was never done learning, which was one of the things about her that Wesley found continuously remarkable and endlessly interesting. On a spring morning in 1884, Wesley saddled Gable, who was older and slower now but still absolutely sound, the most reliable horse he'd ever owned, and rode the perimeter of the property the way he did every Sunday, just to look at it, to understand what they had. 140 acres of Texas hill country, productive and well-watered. A farmhouse that had been repaired and added to until it was comfortable in the specific way that homes become comfortable when people live in them fully. A small herd of cattle that was building itself towards something real. 3 children: Caleb, 16 and already thinking about what his own future land might look like; Jamie, 5 and entirely convinced of his own central importance to all proceedings; Clara Jane, nearly 4, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and was working on combining these into a personality that was going to be extraordinary and possibly challenging. Me, at 37, was the most complete person he had ever known. She had grown into herself further over these years, shed some of the constant wariness she'd carried when he met her, replaced it with something easier, not softness. Me would never be soft. It wasn't her construction, but a willingness to let good things be good without waiting for the cost. She still knew her own mind within 30 seconds of any situation. She still read everything she could find. She still met the land on its own terms, which was the only way the land consented to be met. She still sat across the kitchen table from him in the mornings, with her hands around her coffee cup, and her dark eyes sharp and warm and complicated and entirely real. He thought, as he'd thought before and would go on thinking, that the most fortunate morning of his life was the morning he walked into Callum Briggs's trading post in April of 1878 and heard a woman at the counter say she had a horse to trade. He turned Gable back toward the farmhouse. From the ridge he could see the smoke from the chimney and Caleb in the south field checking the fence line, and if he listened, he could just make out the particular high sound of Jamie's voice from somewhere near the barn, telling Clara something at length, and he could see me in the garden, standing between the rows with her hands on her hips looking at something in the way she had of looking at things that needed solving, focused, present, entirely capable. He rode down the ridge toward home. She looked up when she heard Gable's hooves and shaded her eyes against the morning sun. He lifted his hand from the saddle horn in the small, unhurried wave that was just for her, the one that said without requiring words, "I see you. I'm here. This is where I want to be." She lifted her hand back. He rode into the yard and dismounted, and tied Gable to the fence post and came through the gate. Jamie appeared from somewhere near the barn at a dead run, the way he always appeared, with the urgency of someone who has several things to tell and limited patience for any delay. Clara came behind him at the rolling gait she'd adopted recently, very serious, with a stick she'd apparently decided to carry. Mae walked across the garden to the fence, pushing hair back from her face where it had come loose from her braid. He came to the fence and leaned his arms on the top rail and looked at her across it. "How does it look?" she said. "The southeast section." "Wet enough," he said. "Good wet, not too much. Ready to plant." She nodded, satisfied. "I'll start there Monday." "I'll come help," he said. "I know you will," she said. It was simple, it was everything. She knew he'd come, and he would come, and the land would grow what they put in it, and the children would grow into whoever they were already becoming, and the hill country would be difficult and beautiful and demanding in equal measure, and they would work it together with their hands and their minds, and the accumulated knowledge of people who had learned a place and made it theirs. He reached over the fence rail and tucked a piece of loose hair back behind her ear, his hand resting for a moment at her face, the way it had on the porch the first evening he kissed her, and she leaned into it for just a moment before straightening and giving him the slight, private smile that she kept for him. "Coffee's still hot," she said. "Good," he said. He opened the gate and came through, and Jamie caught him by the hand and began talking immediately, and Clara held up her stick for his inspection as though it required commentary. And Wesley greeted both of these developments with the full attention of a man who understood that this, all of it, the noise and the weight and the beautiful demanding dailiness of it, was exactly what a life was for. And Mae walked beside him toward the farmhouse in the spring morning light, copper grazing in the pasture behind them, the creek running clear along the south edge of the land. The whole bright open world of the Texas hill country spread around them in its difficult and generous entirety, and everything that needed to be true was true, and everything that had been broken had been built back into something better, and there was nothing left unfinished or unsaid or unlived between them that needed to be. They went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the smoke went up straight from the chimney into the clear spring sky.